On a routine night, under the calm blanket of the Southeast Asian sky, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 prepared for a mundane red-eye journey from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Inside the cabin, 227 passengers settled in for the 6-hour trip, families returning home. Artists, engineers, and tourists. In the cockpit of the state-of-the-art Boeing 777-7, one of the safest aircraft ever built, the pilots went through their final checks. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the night, another anonymous light in a sky full of them. 40 minutes into the flight, as it passed from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace, the cockpit gave a final casual sign-off. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Then, it vanished. It didn't just fall off the radar. It blinked out of existence. In an age where every move we make is tracked, logged, and monitored, a 200-foot-long airliner carrying 239 souls was deliberately and completely erased from the world. For the first few hours, the disappearance was masked by confusion. At the Air Traffic Control Center in Kuala Lumpur, the icon for MH370 simply disappeared from their screens. They assumed it had crossed into Vietnamese airspace and handed off control. But in Ho Chi Minh City, the controllers never saw the plane appear. For a critical period, each center believed the other was responsible for the flight. The deafening silence from the cockpit was initially dismissed as a communications glitch. But as minutes turned into hours, a horrifying realization began to dawn. The plane wasn't in Vietnamese airspace. It wasn't in Malaysian airspace. It was nowhere. The initial search began in the South China Sea, where the plane was last seen. Fleets of ships and aircraft from multiple nations descended on the area, scouring the waves for any sign of wreckage, an oil slick, or floating luggage, but they found nothing. It was as if the ocean had swallowed the plane whole, leaving not a single ripple behind. The world was watching, baffled. This wasn't the 1930s. This was an era of satellite tracking and constant connectivity. How could this happen? The answer, when it began to emerge, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The first clue that this was no ordinary accident came not from civilian radar, but from the military. In a shocking revelation, Malaysian military officials admitted their radar had tracked an unidentified aircraft after MH370 had disappeared. The radar showed the plane performing a series of bizarre and deliberate maneuvers. It made a sharp, hard turn to the southwest, flying back across the Malaysian peninsula. It navigated a common flight path, weaving between waypoints, as if to avoid suspicion. It flew for over an hour after its transponder went silent. A ghost plane moving through the night, completely invisible to the commercial aviation world. This single piece of data changed everything. It meant the plane hadn't suffered a sudden, catastrophic failure. Someone was flying it. Someone with expert knowledge of the Boeing 777 had intentionally disabled its communications systems and flown it off its designated course into the darkness. The search in the South China Sea was a waste of time. The plane had been on the other side of the country, and the real mystery had just begun, just as investigators were grappling with the deliberate nature of the flight. Another piece of evidence emerged, this time from space. A British satellite company named Inmarsat discovered something extraordinary. While the plane's main communication systems had been shut down, a small, unassuming satellite data unit in the aircraft's ceiling had continued to operate automatically. For 7 hours after it vanished from radar, this unit sent out a series of hourly handshakes to a satellite positioned in geostationary orbit high above the Indian Ocean. These were not messages containing location data. They were simple electronic pings, the equivalent of the plane telling the satellite, "I'm still here." But for the brilliant engineers at Inmarsat, these pings were a lifeline. By analyzing the time it took for the pings to travel from the aircraft to the satellite and the tiny shifts in their frequency, they were able to perform a calculation that had never been done before. They determined to vast arcs of possible locations for the plane's final ping, one stretching north across Central Asia, and another curving south into the desolate expanse of the southern Indian Ocean. The northern route, which crossed over numerous countries with heavy military radar coverage, was quickly deemed unlikely. No one had seen the plane. That left only one terrifying possibility. MH370 had turned south and flown for hours until it ran out of fuel over the most remote ocean on Earth. With this new data, the focus of the search shifted to a massive, unforgiving stretch of the southern Indian Ocean. The area was thousands of miles from any landmass, a place known for its ferocious winds, colossal waves, and crushing depths. It was one of the most challenging search environments imaginable. An international fleet of ships and aircraft descended on this new zone, hoping to find the debris field that would finally give them an answer. Hope surged when an Australian ship detected a series of underwater pings that seemed to match the frequency of an aircraft's black boxes. For weeks, the world held its breath, believing the final resting place of MH370 had been found. But it was a false dawn. The pings were later determined to be a ghost in the machine, an electronic anomaly from the search equipment itself. After months of searching the surface and years of scouring the seafloor with advanced submersibles, the result was the same: nothing. In 2017, after spending hundreds of millions of dollars and searching an area the size of a country, the official search was suspended. The plane, and the 239 people on board, were declared lost to the abyss. With no wreckage and no clear cause, the investigation turned inward, focusing on the only people with the skill and opportunity to execute such a precise and deliberate act, the pilots. The spotlight fell squarely on the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with an impeccable record. But a search of his home revealed a deeply unsettling clue. On his personal custom-built flight simulator, forensic experts found a deleted flight path. The path showed a plane taking off from Kuala Lumpur, flying northwest up the Strait of Malacca, before turning south and continuing for hours over the Indian Ocean, a journey that eerily mirrored the one investigators believe MH370 took for the authorities. This was the smoking gun. The prevailing theory became that Captain Zahari had meticulously planned a mass murder-suicide, locking his co-pilot out of the cockpit, depressurizing the plane to neutralize the passengers and crew, and flying the aircraft on a ghostly final journey to a place where it would never be found. But this narrative was fiercely contested by his family, friends, and many in the aviation community, who described him as a kind, dedicated professional incapable of such a monstrous act. They argued the simulator data was being taken out of context. The man in the cockpit became a ghost himself, an enigma at the center of a tragedy, either its perpetrator or its first victim. Just as the world began to accept that the plane might never be found, the ocean itself offered up a clue. More than a year after the disappearance, a man cleaning a beach on Reunion Island, a small French territory off the coast of Africa, stumbled upon a piece of aircraft debris. It was a flaperon, a part of the wing. The serial numbers confirmed it was from the missing Boeing 777. Over the next few years, more than 24 other pieces of debris washed ashore on the coastlines of Africa and Madagascar. Ocean current models confirmed that if a plane had crashed in the southern Indian Ocean search area, this is exactly where its debris would end up. The discoveries proved that MH370 had met its end in the ocean, but they also deepened the mystery. Analysis of the flaperon suggested it had been retracted at the moment of impact, indicating the plane was not configured for a gentle, controlled landing on the water. Instead, it pointed to a high-speed catastrophic dive, a death dive from 35,000 feet. This contradicted theories of a pilot who remained in control until the very end, and it opened the door to other, equally terrifying possibilities. One of the most persistent and credible alternative theories centers not on human malice, but on technological failure. Scrutiny of the plane's cargo manifest revealed it was carrying a large shipment of lithium-ion batteries, a product with a known history of spontaneously catching fire. This led to the ghost flight theory. In this scenario, a fire breaks out in the cargo hold, producing toxic smoke that quickly overcomes the pilots and everyone else on board. The fire also damages the plane's electrical systems, disabling the transponder and communications equipment. But the plane itself remains structurally sound, and the autopilot, which was engaged at the time, keeps it flying on its last programmed heading. The initial turn back towards Malaysia could have been the pilot's desperate final act, an attempt to return to the nearest airport before they were incapacitated. The plane would have then continued to fly on its own for hours, a silent, automated tomb, until its fuel tanks ran dry and it plunged into the sea. It is a chilling scenario, but one that explains the known facts without needing to assume a sinister plot. In the vacuum of hard evidence, even more extreme theories began to take root, fueled by a deep distrust of the official narrative. It has been said that the plane was the victim of a remote electronic hijacking. Proponents of this theory point to patents and military technology that could, in the winter of 1959, in the heart of the Soviet Union, 10 of the country's most elite young mountaineers set out on a journey to conquer the frozen peaks of the Ural Mountains. They were masters of their crafts, strong, smart, and meticulously prepared. One member would turn back early due to a sudden illness, a simple twist of fate that would save his life. The other 9 pushed on. Their final photographs and journal entries paint a picture of a challenging but joyful expedition, full of camaraderie and laughter in a vast, white wilderness. But this story does not have a happy ending. Weeks later, a search party would discover their final campsite, and what they found there would become one of the most terrifying and unsolvable mysteries of the 20th century. The camp was a scene of pure illogical horror. A tent, methodically slashed open from the inside, its contents warm, clothes, food, and survival gear left untouched. And out in the crushing sub-zero cold, the 9 bodies of the hikers, scattered across the snow, some bizarrely underdressed, and bearing injuries so violent and so strange, they defy explanation to this day. The first investigators to arrive at the desolate slope of Kholat Syakhl, a name that in the local Mansi language means dead mountain, were confronted with a scene that made no sense. The group's large expedition tent was standing, but it had been ripped to shreds. The cuts, they quickly determined, had been made deliberately and from within. It was the mark of a desperate, panicked escape. But an escape from what? All of their equipment, their axes, knives, warm coats, and boots, were neatly arranged inside. Instead of grabbing these life-saving items, the hikers had fled into the -30°C night, wearing little more than what they had on in their sleeping bags. A trail of footprints led away from the camp, down the snowy slope. In a detail that only deepened the mystery, the prints showed that the hikers were barefoot, or wearing only socks. And they weren't running in a chaotic, blind panic. The tracks showed them moving in a calm, orderly line, as if being deliberately escorted away from the only shelter that could have saved their lives. Over a mile from the abandoned camp, under the branches of a giant cedar tree, the search party found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were stripped down to their underwear, their hands and feet raw and bloodied. Next to them were the charred remains of a small fire. It was clear they had frozen to death, but the scene was a paradox. Why would 2 experienced hikers, with a fully stocked tent just a mile away, freeze to death in their underwear? The branches of the cedar tree above them were snapped off up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting one of them had frantically tried to climb it. Were they trying to get a better view of something? Or were they trying to escape something on the ground? The official cause of death was simple: hypothermia, but the circumstances were anything but. Between the cedar tree and the camp, 3 more bodies were discovered at different intervals. Among them was the group's 23-year-old leader, Igor Dyatlov. Their positions in the snow suggested they had been desperately trying to crawl back to the shelter they had just fled. This detail added another layer of chilling absurdity to the mystery. Something had instilled in them a terror so profound that it made them slice open their tent and run into a deadly blizzard. But, at some point, that terror was replaced by an even greater one, the realization that they were going to die in the cold. What could have created such a horrifying choice? For these 3, and the 2 at the cedar tree, the investigation concluded with the same mundane verdict: they had all frozen to death. With 5 bodies accounted for, the case seemed to be a tragic but explainable story of disorientation and panic. But what the investigators would find next would shatter that illusion forever. For 2 long months, the remaining 4 hikers were missing. Finally, as the spring thaw began to melt the snow, they were found buried under 13 feet of snow, in a makeshift den dug into the side of a ravine. And it was here that the true horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident was revealed. These hikers had not frozen to death. They had suffered injuries so catastrophic and so bizarre that the lead medical examiner was left stunned. One of the men, Semyon Zolotarev, had his ribs crushed into fragments. Another, Nicholas Thibobrioniolis, had suffered a massive, shattering skull fracture. The doctor compared the force required to inflict such damage to that of a modern-day car crash or a powerful blast wave. And yet, inexplicably, their bodies bore no external signs of trauma. There were no bruises, no cuts, no soft tissue damage whatsoever. It was as if they had been squeezed by an immense, invisible force. But the most grotesque discovery was the body of Ludmila Dubinina. She had the same devastating internal chest injuries, but she was also missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips and jawbone. Just when the story seemed like it couldn't get any stranger, the investigators uncovered 2 final, inexplicable pieces of evidence that pushed the incident into the realm of high strangeness. When the clothing of the 4 hikers found in the ravine was tested for radiation, it came back with inexplicably high readings. The source of this radioactive contamination has never been found or explained. At the same time, testimony began to surface from another hiking group and local villagers miles away. On the night the Dyatlov group died, they reported seeing strange, silent orange spheres of light moving and hovering in the sky, directly over the region of Dead Mountain. Faced with evidence, they could not comprehend and explained lights, inexplicable radiation, and impossible injuries. The Soviet authorities did something unheard of. They abruptly closed the investigation, sealed the files, and barred access to the entire region for 3 years. The official cause of death for the group was attributed to a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. This vague, cryptic conclusion was not an answer. It was an admission that they had no idea what happened. For decades, the case remained a dark secret, but as the files were unsealed, theories began to swirl. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the case and offered a new official explanation: a slab avalanche. They argued that a small, localized avalanche had struck the tent, causing the initial panic. This theory, however, has been widely rejected by independent researchers as a convenient but deeply flawed explanation. An avalanche powerful enough to cause the internal injuries found on the victims would have flattened the tent and left a massive debris field, neither of which were found. It doesn't explain why the footprints showed a calm, orderly retreat, not a panicked scramble, and it certainly doesn't account for the radiation or the missing tongue. For many, the avalanche theory is seen as nothing more than an attempt to close the book on a deeply uncomfortable mystery. With the official story so full of holes, many researchers have turned their attention to a far more sinister possibility: a secret military weapons test. In the late 1950s, the Ural Mountains were a hotbed of clandestine Soviet military